I pulled the car to a stop about 20 feet from the rusted checkpoint gates, the engine ticking as it cooled in the humid evening air. The GPS had led us down increasingly sketchy dirt roads for the past hour, each turn taking us deeper into the cypress swamps of St. Tammany Parish. My hands were still gripping the steering wheel harder than necessary. "This is it," I said, checking the coordinates on my phone one more time. The screen showed we'd arrived at our destination, though the place looked more like the entrance to a forgotten nightmare than the abandoned military facility we'd been tracking down for months. David leaned forward in the passenger seat, craning his neck to get a better look through the windshield. The chain-link fence stretched in both directions, disappearing into the thick vegetation that had been slowly reclaiming this corner of Louisiana for who knows how long. Razor wire coiled along the top like metallic thorns, though several sections had sagged or broken away entirely. "No guards," David observed, pointing toward the unmanned checkpoint booth. The small concrete structure sat empty, its windows dark and one door hanging open at an odd angle. "Feels weird that they just left the gates open like that." I killed the engine and sat back, taking in the scene. The entrance gates stood wide, as if someone had simply walked away from their post and never bothered coming back. Weeds pushed up through cracks in the asphalt around the checkpoint, and a faded military insignia on the booth was barely visible through years of weathering and moss growth. "We drove 3 hours to get here," I reminded him, already reaching for the door handle. "Besides, other explorers have been through this place. If it was really off limits, they would have posted new security or welded the gates shut." David made a non-committal sound, but didn't argue further. He knew I'd been planning this expedition for months, ever since a guy on one of the urban exploration forums had posted cryptic references to a flooded military complex in the Louisiana bayou, with some of the most interesting architecture he'd ever documented. The post had been taken down within hours, but I'd managed to piece together enough clues to narrow down the location. I stepped out of the car and immediately felt the oppressive weight of the humid air settling around me like a damp blanket. The temperature had dropped maybe 10 degrees since we'd left the main highway, but the moisture made everything feel thick and heavy. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear the low chorus of frogs and insects that seemed to follow you everywhere in this part of the state. David emerged from the passenger side and walked over to the fence, running his fingers along the chain links. "How old do you think this place is?" "Hard to say." I popped the trunk and started pulling out our gear. Could be anything from Cold War era to something more recent that got decommissioned after budget cuts. The architecture will tell us more once we get inside. The military base spread out before us in the gathering darkness, a collection of concrete structures that looked like they'd been half swallowed by the swampland. Even from here, I could see dark water reflecting what little light remained in the sky. Most of the buildings were partially submerged, their lower levels disappearing beneath the surface of what looked like a large, artificial lake. "That's a lot more water than I expected," David said, following my line of sight. I pulled our wetsuits from the trunk and laid them across the hood of the car. Good thing we came prepared. The gear check had become a ritual over the 5 years I'd been doing this. 2 full-body wetsuits, though David's had a small tear near the left shoulder that he kept meaning to patch. Waterproof headlamps with fresh batteries and backups. Diving knives strapped to our calves, not because we expected to encounter anything particularly dangerous, but because you never knew when you'd need to cut through debris or tangled vegetation. I had my waterproof camera in a sealed case, plus a backup memory card and extra batteries stored in separate waterproof containers. David suited up first, struggling a bit with the wetsuit zipper. "Remind me why we couldn't do this during daylight hours." "Because daylight hours bring park rangers, local cops, and curious locals," I said, pulling my own wetsuit over my clothes. "Night exploration is safer exploration." The wetsuit felt familiar against my skin, like putting on armor before heading into battle. I'd worn this same gear through flooded subway tunnels in Detroit, abandoned missile silos in North Dakota, and a half-submerged shopping mall outside of Houston after Hurricane Harvey. Each location had taught me something new about navigating underwater environments and managing the unique challenges they presented. I clipped my headlamp to the front of my wetsuit and tested the beam. The light cut through the growing darkness, illuminating the nearest building about 100 yards away. The structure looked like it might have been an administrative complex, with multiple floors and what appeared to be a parking area that had long since become part of the artificial lake surrounding it. "Water level looks stable," I said, more to myself than to David. "No current that I can see. Should be easy enough to wade through." David finished adjusting his gear and joined me at the fence line. His headlamp beam joined mine, creating overlapping circles of light that danced across the dark water. "How deep do you think it gets?" "Only one way to find out." I shouldered my waterproof pack and took one last look at our equipment setup. Everything was secure. All the zippers were closed, and both of our lights were functioning properly. The diving knives were easily accessible but safely sheathed. Camera gear was protected and ready for whatever we might discover inside those concrete shells. "Ready?" I asked, though I was already walking toward the open gates. David fell into step beside me, his boots crunching on the gravel path that led from the checkpoint into the base proper. "Let's get this over with." We passed through the entrance without incident, leaving our car behind as we approached the edge of the dark water. The stagnant surface reflected our headlamp beams back at us like black mirrors, and I could smell the earthy, organic scent of decomposing vegetation mixed with something vaguely metallic. I stepped into the water first, feeling the lukewarm liquid push against my legs as it rose past my knees. The bottom was softer than I'd expected, a mixture of mud and decomposing organic matter that gave slightly under each step. 20 minutes had passed since we'd crossed through the entrance gates, most of that time spent double-checking our gear and plotting our route to the main administrative building. David waded in behind me, his headlamp beams sweeping across the dark surface as he found his footing. "Spoke too soon," he muttered, adjusting his wetsuit collar. "Already getting seepage through this damn tear." I pulled out my waterproof camera and snapped a few shots of our entry point, documenting the approach to the building just like I did at every location. The flash illuminated floating debris that hadn't been visible in our headlamp beams, pieces of office furniture, chunks of ceiling tile, and what looked like a waterlogged desk chair drifting past us like some kind of bizarre parade. The water reached our waists by the time we approached the main entrance to the administrative building. The glass doors had long since been shattered, leaving jagged frames that we carefully maneuvered around. I tested each step before committing my full weight, remembering too many stories of explorers falling through rotted floors or stepping into unseen holes. "How's the temperature?" I asked, though I could already feel the chill starting to work its way through my own wetsuit. "Cold as hell," David replied, his voice carrying a note of irritation. "This water's definitely getting through the tear. Feels like ice against my shoulder." We pushed deeper into the building's interior, our headlamps revealing a maze of hallways and office spaces that had been completely transformed by years of flooding. Filing cabinets stood like metal islands, their upper drawers still above the waterline but their contents long since destroyed. Computer monitors sat on desks that were now several feet underwater, their screens dark and covered in a thin layer of algae. I raised my camera and captured shots of the submerged office equipment, the way our lights created eerie shadows on the walls where water stains marked previous flood levels. This place had been underwater for a while, probably years, judging by the amount of growth I could see coating every surface. "Check this out," I said, wading over to a filing cabinet that was partially open. The top drawer contained what looked like military documents, but the paper had turned to mush from prolonged water exposure. I could make out fragments of letterhead and official stamps, but nothing readable. David followed me over, his movement through the water creating small waves that rippled outward in the confined space. Any idea what kind of operation they were running here? Whatever it was, they left in a hurry. I gestured toward the scattered paperwork and overturned furniture. This doesn't look like a planned evacuation. We continued deeper into the facility, ducking under ceiling tiles that hung down like broken teeth. Some had fallen completely, creating floating obstacles we had to push aside or navigate around. The building's layout was more complex than I'd anticipated. Not just a simple office structure, but a series of interconnected wings that branched off in multiple directions. David stepped forward and suddenly cursed, his whole body jerking as he pulled his foot back. Damn it, stepped on something sharp. I moved my headlamp beam toward where he'd been walking and could see dark shapes beneath the murky surface. Pieces of broken glass, maybe metal debris from collapsed equipment. Watch where you're stepping, I warned, though I knew the advice was mostly useless in water this dark. Can't see what's down there? He lifted his foot and examined the sole of his wetsuit boot, checking for tears or punctures. Feels like it went right through. These boots aren't meant for this kind of debris field. The sound of our movement echoed off the concrete walls in an odd rhythm. Splash, pause, that seemed to follow us through each room we entered. Every step stirred up sediment from the bottom, creating small clouds that drifted in our lights like underwater dust storms. We approached what appeared to be a security checkpoint, complete with metal detector archways that still stood upright in the flooded corridor despite years of submersion. The electronic equipment was obviously dead, but the physical structures remained intact, creating narrow passages we had to squeeze through single file. This is definitely military, David observed, running his hand along one of the metal detector frames. Civilian buildings don't usually have this level of security infrastructure. I photographed the checkpoint setup, trying to capture the surreal image of sophisticated security equipment standing guard over nothing but empty water and floating debris. The contrast between the high-tech metal detectors and the primitive swamp environment that had reclaimed this place created exactly the kind of visual I'd been hoping to document. Moving past the checkpoint, we entered what had once been a large open area, maybe a lobby or central processing space. The ceiling was higher here, and our headlamp beams barely reached the far walls. Islands of furniture created an obstacle course that forced us to wind back and forth, following whatever path the arrangement of desks and filing cabinets allowed. "How much further do you want to go?" David asked, his voice carrying a hint of exhaustion. The cold water was clearly getting to him more than he wanted to admit. I checked my camera's memory card status and battery level. Still plenty of space for more shots, and we'd only been exploring for about 30 minutes. "Let's see what's in the next wing," I replied, pointing toward a corridor that led deeper into the complex. "We came all this way. Might as well make it count." David's scream tore through the enclosed space like a gunshot. I spun around so fast I nearly lost my balance, my headlamp beam cutting across the dark water to where David was thrashing near a collapsed desk. His whole body convulsed as he clutched at his left leg, and I could see dark tendrils spreading through the water around him. Blood, mixing with the murky liquid in slow, ominous clouds. The thick, unmistakable body of a water moccasin slid past my peripheral vision before disappearing into the depths with barely a ripple. The snake was gone before I could even process what I'd seen, vanishing into the maze of submerged furniture and debris like it had never been there at all. "David!" I pushed through the water toward him, my movements creating waves that scattered the blood clouds in all directions. He was bent over, trying to pull up the leg of his wetsuit while still maintaining his balance in the chest-deep water. "Got me," he gasped, his voice tight with pain and panic. "Right through the wetsuit, I can see the holes." I reached him just as he managed to roll up the neoprene material, revealing 2 distinct puncture wounds just above his ankle. The marks were already beginning to swell, the skin around them taking on an angry red color that was visible even in the limited light from our headlamps. Fresh blood oozed from both wounds, creating new clouds in the water. My diving knife was in my hand before I'd consciously decided to draw it. I swept the beam of my light across the surrounding water, searching for any sign of the snake's return. Water moccasins were aggressive, not like other snakes that would bite once and retreat. This one could still be nearby, waiting for another opportunity. "Where is it?" David demanded, his voice rising in pitch. "Can you see it?" "It's gone," I said, though I kept the knife ready and continued scanning the water. "Probably moved off when you started thrashing." David's breathing was getting faster, shorter. He kept looking down at his leg, then back up at me, his eyes wide behind his headlamp's beam. I can feel it burning, the pains moving up my leg already. The burning sensation was probably psychological. Snake venom didn't work that fast, but I wasn't about to tell him that while we were standing in contaminated water with an unknown number of venomous snakes potentially surrounding us. Water moccasins liked environments exactly like this. Stagnant, warm water with plenty of places to hide and abundant food sources. "We need to get out of here," David continued, already starting to wade back toward the corridor we'd come from. "I need to call for help. Get to a hospital." "Hold on." I grabbed his arm, stopping his movement. "We're already here. We're suited up. We've got our gear. We've invested 3 hours driving out here, plus however long we've been exploring." David stared at me like I'd suggested he cut off his own leg. "Are you insane? I just got bitten by a water moccasin in a contaminated swamp. I need medical attention." "Water moccasin bites aren't usually fatal," I said, though I kept my voice calm and measured. "You've got time. We could finish documenting this wing, maybe check out one more section, then head back." "No." David's voice was flat, final. "I'm not going deeper into this place with who knows how many snakes in the water. The burning is getting worse." I looked down at his ankle. The swelling was definitely more pronounced now, and the skin around the bite marks had taken on a mottled appearance. But he was still standing, still coherent, still able to move under his own power. Snake bites were serious, but they weren't usually immediately life-threatening. People survived water moccasin bites all the time. "David, we may never get another opportunity like this," I pressed. "This place could be sealed off tomorrow. Military sites like this don't stay accessible forever." "I don't care." He pulled his arm free from my grip and started moving toward the exit again. "I'm leaving. You can come with me or you can stay, but I'm not spending another minute in this water. Come on, man. Don't let one snake ruin the whole expedition." David stopped and turned back to face me, his headlamp beam cutting across my face and making me squint. "One snake? James, we're standing in a flooded building in the middle of a Louisiana swamp. There could be dozens of them in here. Hundreds. And I've already been bitten once." The pain and fear in his voice were genuine, but so was my frustration. I'd been planning this exploration for months. I'd studied satellite images, researched the facility's history, coordinated our schedules, driven 3 hours through increasingly sketchy back roads to get here. The documentation I'd gathered so far was good, but it wasn't complete. There were entire sections of this complex we hadn't even seen yet. "Fine," I said. "Go back to the car. call whoever you need to call, but I'm finishing what we came here to do." David's expression shifted from pain to something that might have been anger. "You're going to stay here alone? After what just happened?" "I've got my knife. I'll be more careful about where I step." I gestured toward the corridor leading deeper into the facility. "There's a whole complex here we haven't explored. I'm not walking away from that because of one snake." "This is stupid, James. This is really, really stupid." "Maybe, but it's my choice." David stared at me for several more seconds, his headlamp beam wavering slightly as he shifted his weight from one foot to the other. I could tell he was trying to decide whether to make one more attempt at convincing me, but the pain in his ankle was clearly winning out over his concern for my safety. "Whatever," he said finally. "I'm done arguing. I'm getting out of this water before something else decides to take a bite out of me." He turned and started wading back toward the main entrance, moving as quickly as the chest-deep water would allow. His headlamp beam bounced off the walls and ceiling as he navigated around submerged furniture, creating a light show that gradually faded as he put more distance between us. I called after him once, "David," but he didn't stop or look back. Within a few minutes, his light had disappeared completely around the corner, leaving me alone in the flooded hallway with nothing but the sound of my own breathing and the gentle lapping of water against the concrete walls. The silence that followed felt different than it had when we'd been exploring together. Heavier somehow, more aware of itself. I shifted my grip on the diving knife and took a long, slow look around the space where the snakebite had occurred. No sign of the water moccasin or any other wildlife, but I made a mental note to be more deliberate about testing each step before committing my full weight. My heart was still beating faster than normal from the encounter, but the adrenaline felt good, energizing. This was exactly the kind of unexpected challenge that made urban exploration worthwhile. The reminder that these places weren't just empty shells waiting to be photographed, but environments with their own dangers and surprises. I checked my camera's battery level and memory card status. Still plenty of capacity for whatever I might discover in the unexplored sections. The waterproof case had protected the equipment perfectly so far, and I documented some excellent shots of the flooded office spaces and security checkpoint. Without David's constant commentary and complaints about the cold water, I could focus entirely on the exploration itself. I turned my headlamp beam toward the corridor I'd been considering earlier and started moving in that direction, testing each step carefully, but maintaining a steady pace through the murky water. I pushed through the water toward the corridor I'd been studying earlier, moving with more deliberate steps after the snake encounter. The diving knife remained ready in my hand, and I swept my headlamp beam across the surface ahead of each step, checking for movement or dark shapes that might indicate more wildlife lurking in the murky depths. The corridor led to a junction where 3 different passages branched off in different directions. Most of the doorways I'd encountered so far had been standard office entrances with shattered glass and twisted frames, but the opening at the end of the left passage caught my attention immediately. Unlike the others, this one was sealed by a heavy metal door that appeared intact despite years of flooding. I waded closer and examined the surface, running my fingers across raised lettering that read, "Authorized personnel only," in block military stenciling. Below that, smaller text warned about restricted access and referenced security clearance levels I didn't recognize. The door itself was made of reinforced steel, far heavier than anything else I'd seen in the facility so far. A wheel-style handle dominated the center of the door, similar to what you'd find on a submarine bulkhead or bank vault. The metal showed extensive corrosion around the edges, but the mechanism appeared functional. I gripped the wheel and applied pressure, feeling it resist for a moment before giving way with a grinding sound that echoed through the water around me. The door swung inward, revealing a staircase that descended into darkness below the current water level. I could see that the steps continued down for at least 20 feet, disappearing beneath the surface entirely. This wasn't just another flooded office space. This was access to a lower level of the facility that I hadn't even known existed. I took several photos of the door and the entrance before committing to the descent. The staircase was concrete, worn smooth in places but still solid enough to support my weight. As I moved down step by step, the water level rose higher on my body, past my stomach, up to my chest, then higher still until it reached my collarbone. Moving through chest-deep water required a completely different approach than the waist-deep areas I'd been navigating upstairs. Each step became a deliberate process of lifting my legs high enough to clear the bottom, while maintaining my balance against the increased resistance. The diving knife made the movement even more awkward, but I wasn't about to put it away in an environment where visibility was essentially zero below the surface. The basement level opened into a space that was immediately different from everything I'd seen upstairs. Instead of office furniture and administrative equipment, this area contained what looked like sophisticated laboratory or command center infrastructure. Banks of electronic equipment lined the walls, their metal housing covered in rust and thick layers of algae, but the underlying structure suggested technology far more advanced than typical military administrative systems. I raised my camera and began documenting the space methodically, capturing wide shots that showed the overall layout before moving in for detailed photographs of specific equipment clusters. Most of the machinery was unrecognizable to me, possibly specialized military hardware or research equipment that had been classified during the facility's operational period. A doorway at the far end of the laboratory space led to what appeared to be a control room. The water here was even deeper, reaching nearly to my shoulders. But I could make out the shapes of control consoles and monitoring equipment arranged in a semicircle facing a large wall-mounted display screen. I pushed through the resistance of the deeper water, feeling the cold liquid seep through the small gaps in my wetsuit's ceiling. The temperature down here was noticeably lower than the upper levels, and I could see my breath creating small puffs of condensation in the beam of my headlamp. The control room contained banks of computer equipment that looked like they dated from the 1980s or early 1990s, bulky CRT monitors, tape drive systems, and control panels covered in switches and indicator lights. Everything was covered in the same rust and algae growth I'd seen throughout the facility, but the arrangement suggested this had been the nerve center for whatever operations had taken place here. At the center of the main console, mounted in a clear protective housing, was a large red button surrounded by warning labels and activation procedures. I moved closer and used my headlamp to illuminate the text, reading Project Ascension, Emergency Activation, printed in official military typeface below the button housing. Additional warning text covered the panel around the button, referencing authorization codes, emergency protocols, and consequences for unauthorized activation. The language was bureaucratic and clinical, but the underlying message was clear. This button controlled something significant enough to require multiple levels of security clearance and emergency-only usage guidelines. I was preparing to photograph the control panel when my light caught something else on the wall beside the button assembly. Someone had written a message directly on the concrete surface in what looked like dried blood. The lettering was crude, but legible. If you're reading this, push the button. Save them all. The water isn't rising by accident. The sight of the message sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the cold water. I moved my headlamp beam closer to examine the writing more carefully. The substance appeared to be blood, dark reddish-brown stains that had dried into the porous concrete surface. But the condition of the writing troubled me. Despite the obvious age and abandonment of the facility, These letters looked relatively fresh, as if they'd been written recently. I photographed the message from multiple angles, making sure to capture both the text itself and its position relative to the emergency activation button. The juxtaposition was unsettling. Someone had been down here recently enough to leave a message, and they'd chosen to write it in blood next to what appeared to be some kind of emergency system. The implications of the message itself were equally disturbing. "The water isn't rising by accident," suggested that the flooding of this facility wasn't just the result of natural processes or infrastructure failure. Someone believed it was intentional, part of whatever Project Ascension had been designed to accomplish. I studied the button housing more carefully, looking for any indication of whether the system might still be functional. Some of the indicator lights on the surrounding panel showed faint glows, suggesting that power was still reaching at least some of the equipment down here. The possibility that the emergency activation system might actually work if triggered added another layer of uncertainty to the situation. My finger hovered near the protective housing for several seconds as I considered the options. The message writer clearly wanted someone to activate whatever system this button controlled. But triggering unknown military equipment in an abandoned facility seemed like exactly the kind of decision that could have serious consequences extending far beyond my personal safety. I decided against pressing the button and moved away from the control panel to explore the rest of the basement level. Whatever Project Ascension had been, I could research it later using the photographs I'd taken. Actually activating emergency systems was beyond the scope of urban exploration, and definitely beyond my comfort level with unknown risks. The basement level contained several additional rooms connected by corridors that were completely submerged. I had to duck my head below the surface to navigate some of the doorways, using my hands to feel for the openings while holding my breath. The water down here was significantly colder than the upper levels, and I could feel the chill working its way through my wetsuit despite the neoprene insulation. As I explored the additional spaces, I began noticing something unusual about the algae growth on the walls. Rather than the random organic patterns I'd seen throughout the rest of the facility, the growth down here seemed to follow more deliberate arrangements. Lines and geometric shapes appeared to be traced in the algae coating, as if someone had been deliberately cultivating or arranging the growth into specific patterns. I photographed several examples of the unusual algae formations, though I wasn't sure what to make of them. The patterns were too regular to be natural, but I couldn't determine what purpose they might serve or who might have created them. Like the blood message upstairs, they suggested that someone had been down here more recently than the facility's abandonment date would indicate. The basement level was larger than I'd anticipated, with multiple rooms and storage areas that would take hours to explore thoroughly. But the combination of the deeper, colder water and the increasingly strange discoveries was beginning to wear on me. I documented the most significant findings: the control room, the emergency activation system, and the blood message, and gathered enough material to research Project Ascension from the safety of my own computer. I took a final set of photographs showing the overall layout of the basement level before beginning the process of working my way back toward the staircase. The return journey through the chest-deep water felt longer and more difficult than the initial descent, partly due to fatigue and partly due to the lingering unease from the message and the strange algae patterns. I was working my way back through one of the basement corridors, feeling the resistance of the chest-deep water against each step, when my headlamp beam suddenly wavered and died completely. The darkness that followed was absolute. Not the kind of dim lighting you get in a poorly lit room, but the complete absence of any visual reference points whatsoever. I couldn't see my own hand when I held it inches from my face. I stopped moving immediately, knowing that taking even one more step in this environment could send me crashing into submerged equipment or worse. The cold water lapped against my chest as I stood perfectly still, trying to orient myself in the pitch-black space. My heart rate picked up as the reality of the situation hit me. I was alone in a flooded basement with no backup light source and no clear path back to the staircase. "Stupid," I muttered, reaching for the waterproof pack clipped to my wetsuit. I should have brought a backup headlamp, not just spare batteries. 5 years of urban exploration, and I'd made a rookie mistake that could have gotten me killed in a place like this. My fingers worked through the contents of the pack by feel, searching for the battery compartment while trying not to drop anything into the water. The cold was making my hands less responsive than usual, and I fumbled with the small components more than I would have liked. I found the spare batteries and began the process of removing the old ones from my headlamp, working entirely by touch. That's when I heard the splashing. The sound came from somewhere behind me in the flooded corridor I'd just navigated. It wasn't the gentle lapping of water against walls that had been my constant companion throughout the exploration. This was the distinct sound of something large moving through the water, with deliberate motion. Slow, rhythmic disturbances that suggested weight and purpose. "David?" I called out, thinking maybe my friend had changed his mind about leaving and come back to find me. "That you, man?" No response. Just more splashing, closer now and definitely moving in my direction. I worked faster with the battery replacement, my fingers trying to locate the correct orientation in the darkness. The splashing sounds were becoming more regular, more methodical. Something was definitely making its way through the water toward my position, and whatever it was didn't seem concerned about making noise. "David, if that's you, say something." I called again, louder this time. My voice echoed off the concrete walls around me, but no answer came back. Only more splashing, steady and persistent. The battery compartment finally clicked shut and I pressed the power button on my headlamp. The beam flickered once, then came on steady and bright, cutting through the darkness like a knife. I immediately spun around toward the source of the splashing sounds, sweeping the light across the flooded corridor behind me. The beam illuminated something floating about 15 feet away that made my breath catch in my throat. A human body drifted face down in the dark water, arms spread wide and completely motionless. The person was wearing what looked like military fatigues, the same type of uniform I'd seen referenced in some of the facility documentation upstairs. But the condition of the body was wrong. All wrong. The exposed skin was bloated and discolored, a mottled gray-green that spoke of advanced decomposition. Large patches of flesh had sloughed away entirely, revealing white bone underneath. I kept my light trained on the corpse, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Bodies didn't just float randomly in abandoned facilities. Someone had died down here, probably years ago based on the state of decomposition, and had been preserved by the cold, stagnant water. But that didn't explain the splashing sounds I'd been hearing. As I watched, the body slowly began to turn over in the water. The movement was gradual but unmistakable. Arms shifting position, torso rotating, the whole form beginning to roll from face down to face up. I told myself it was water current or some shift in buoyancy, but there was no current down here. The water had been perfectly still throughout my entire exploration. The corpse completed its rotation, and I found myself looking at its face. The features were barely recognizable as human, flesh hanging in gray strips, empty eye sockets filled with cloudy white material, jaw hanging open at an unnatural angle. Dark water poured from the mouth in a steady stream as the head tilted upward. Then the eyes focused on me. The cloudy white orbs turned in their sockets with deliberate precision, tracking my headlamp beam until they were looking directly at me. The mouth moved, releasing more dark water along with what might have been an attempt at vocalization, a wet, gurgling sound that echoed through the flooded space. The corpse's arms began to move through the water, not floating or drifting, but paddling with clear intention and direction. The decomposed hands pushed against the water in slow but steady strokes, propelling the body forward through the corridor toward where I stood, frozen in shock. I gripped my diving knife tighter and backed away, the blade's weight suddenly feeling inadequate against whatever was approaching me through the murky water. The dead man's arms continued their rhythmic motion, each stroke bringing the deteriorated form closer to my position, while those milky eyes remained fixed on mine. I turned and ran. The water fought against every movement, transforming what should have been a sprint into a desperate struggle through liquid concrete. Each step required lifting my legs high enough to clear the resistance while maintaining forward momentum, and the chest-deep water made balance precarious with every stride. Behind me, violent splashing erupted as the corpse gave chase, creating waves that pushed against my back and shoulders. The creature moved through the water with a strength that defied everything I understood about decomposed flesh. The splashing sounds were rhythmic and powerful, suggesting coordination and purpose that no dead thing should possess. I could hear it thrashing through the flooded corridor, closing the distance between us with each passing second. My headlamp beam bounced wildly as I fought my way toward the staircase, illuminating fragments of the basement level in chaotic flashes. Submerged equipment and debris created obstacles that I had to navigate around or push through, and twice I stumbled over objects hidden beneath the dark surface. The first time was a fallen ceiling beam that caught my shin and nearly sent me sprawling. The second was what felt like a metal cabinet that had toppled over, and I barely managed to regain my balance before continuing forward. The diving knife remained clenched in my right hand, though its weight made maintaining proper swimming form impossible. I switched it to my left hand, trying to use my right arm for better balance while pushing through the water. The blade caught on floating debris once, jerking my arm backward and costing me precious momentum. The staircase appeared in my headlamp beam just as the splashing behind me reached a crescendo. I could feel the waves from the creature's movement pushing against my back, like hands trying to drag me backward into the depths. The concrete steps looked impossibly steep from water level, but I grabbed the handrail and hauled myself upward with both arms, my legs kicking frantically to find purchase on the submerged lower steps. My boots slipped on the wet concrete surface. The algae growth that covered everything in the facility had made the stairs treacherous, and my right foot shot out from under me just as I thought I'd found solid footing. I fell backward into the water with a splash that sent waves radiating outward in all directions. The corpse lunged at me before I could recover. Decomposed hands grabbed my left shoulder, fingers digging into the neoprene of my wetsuit with surprising strength. The creature's momentum drove both of us deeper into the water, and I felt the cold liquid rise past my collar line toward my face. Those milky white eyes were inches from mine, fixed on my headlamp beam with an intensity that seemed impossible from something that should have been dead for years. The stench hit me like a physical blow. Putrid decomposition mixed with stagnant swamp water created an odor so overwhelming that my stomach lurched involuntarily. Gases from the creature's deteriorating flesh bubbled up around us, adding to the toxic cocktail of scents that made breathing almost impossible. I brought the diving knife up and drove it into the corpse's torso, feeling the blade punch through waterlogged flesh and scrape against bone underneath. Dark fluid leaked from the wound, but the creature didn't react to the damage. Its grip on my shoulder remained firm, and it continued trying to pull me deeper beneath the surface. I stabbed again, this time aiming for what remained of its ribcage. The knife went in easily, meeting little resistance from the decomposed tissue, but again the creature showed no response to what should have been fatal injuries. The dead man's jaw hung open, releasing more dark water and making wet, gurgling sounds that might have been attempts at vocalization. Panic started to override rational thought as I realized the knife wasn't going to stop this thing. I abandoned the blade and used both hands to grab the creature's wrists, trying to break its hold on my wetsuit. The flesh felt spongy and cold beneath my fingers, but the underlying strength was undeniable. Whatever was animating this corpse possessed far more power than its deteriorated condition should have allowed. I drew my legs up and kicked out hard, planting both boots against the creature's chest and pushing with everything I had. The impact sent the corpse backward through the water, breaking its grip on my shoulder and giving me the space I needed to scramble toward the stairs again. This time I didn't try to stand upright. I crawled up the concrete steps on my hands and knees, using the handrail to pull myself higher, while my boots searched for secure footing on each step. Water poured from my wetsuit as I climbed, and I could hear the creature thrashing in the flooded area below, already working its way back toward the staircase. I reached the main level and hauled myself to my feet, not bothering to look back as I heard splashing footsteps beginning to climb the stairs behind me. The basement had been a mistake from the beginning, and now I was paying the price for pushing too far into places that should have remained unexplored. The main level corridors stretched ahead of me, filled with waist-deep water that suddenly felt shallow and manageable after the chest-deep basement areas. I ran through the flooded hallways, pushing past submerged furniture and debris while searching for any exit that would lead back to the surface. My headlamp beam swept back and forth across doorways and side passages, looking for the familiar sight of an entrance leading to the outside. Behind me, the sound of splashing footsteps grew closer as the creature reached the main level and began its pursuit through the administrative areas. The dead man moved with the same inhuman strength and coordination that had made it so dangerous in the basement, apparently unhindered by the change in water depth or terrain. I passed the security checkpoint where David and I had entered the facility's interior sections, recognizing the metal detector archways, even in my panicked state. The exit had to be close now, but the facility's layout was more complex than I'd realized during our initial exploration. Corridors branched in multiple directions, and in my current state, I couldn't remember which path would lead back to the main entrance. The splashing behind me was getting louder and more regular, suggesting the creature was gaining ground despite my head start. I chose the corridor that felt most familiar and pushed through the water as fast as possible, hoping my sense of direction would prove accurate. Wrong turns at this point could trap me in dead-end areas where the creature would have time to catch up. An emergency exit sign appeared in my headlamp beam, mounted high on the wall above what looked like a heavy door. The red lettering was faded, but still readable, and more importantly, the door appeared to lead directly outside rather than to another interior section of the facility. I waded toward it as quickly as possible, already reaching for the push bar before I'd fully crossed the room. I slammed my shoulder against the emergency exit door, feeling the metal give way as I burst through into the humid Louisiana night. The transition from the stagnant, putrid air of the flooded facility to the open swamp atmosphere hit me like a wall of relief. My legs carried me across the muddy ground in uneven strides, wetsuit boots slipping on patches of wet grass and decomposing leaves as I ran toward our parked car. David was leaning against the passenger side door, his pale face illuminated by the dome light he'd turned on inside the vehicle. His left leg was propped at an awkward angle, and even from a distance, I could see the swelling around his ankle had gotten worse. When he spotted me approaching at a dead run, his expression shifted from tired discomfort to immediate concern. "Jesus, what happened?" he called out as I reached the car. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I braced myself against the hood, trying to catch my breath while my hands shook from adrenaline. The words came out in broken fragments between gasps. "There was, in the basement, a dead body. But it wasn't dead. It moved. It grabbed me." David pushed himself away from the car, studying my face in the dim light. "What are you talking about? A body?" "Military uniform, decomposed, been dead for years, but it was moving through the water, chasing me." I wiped swamp water from my face, realizing how insane the words sounded even as I spoke them. It had these white eyes that tracked my movement, and it was strong, way stronger than something that deteriorated should be. "Slow down." David hobbled closer, favoring his injured leg. "You're saying you found a dead person who was walking around, swimming, through the flooded basement. I had to stab it with my knife, but the wounds didn't stop it." I gestured toward the facility, where my headlamp beam was still visible through the broken emergency exit door. It followed me all the way to the stairs. I barely got out. David looked back toward the facility, then at me again. His expression had shifted from concern to something closer to skepticism. "Maybe we should get out of here and talk about this somewhere else. That snake bite has me pretty messed up, and you've been down there alone for over an hour. Stress does weird things to people." The drive back to our motel felt longer than the initial trip to the facility. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following us down the dark country roads. David spent most of the journey examining his bite wound and occasionally mentioning that the burning sensation was spreading up his calf. Neither of us talked much about what I'd encountered in the basement. By the time we reached the motel, David's ankle was swollen enough that he had trouble putting weight on it. He took some photos of the bite marks and called a nurse hotline for advice about water moccasin envenomation. The nurse recommended monitoring for systemic symptoms and seeking medical attention if his condition worsened overnight. I lay awake most of the night, replaying the encounter with the corpse over and over in my mind. Every detail remained vivid: the way the decomposed flesh felt beneath my fingers, the sound of dark water pouring from its mouth, the deliberate tracking motion of those milky white eyes. No stress-induced hallucination could account for such specific sensory information. The next morning, I convinced David to return to the facility with me and 2 St. Tammany Parish Sheriff's deputies. David's ankle was still swollen, but he could walk with minimal limping. The deputies were middle-aged local officers who seemed skeptical about the whole situation, but agreed to investigate my claims as a potential crime scene. Deputy Martinez was a stocky man with graying temples who'd worked the parish for over 15 years. His partner, Deputy Chen, was younger, but carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd dealt with plenty of unusual calls in rural Louisiana. Both officers wore waders and carried waterproof flashlights as we approached the facility in broad daylight. "You boys understand this is trespassing, right?" Martinez said as we reached the entrance gates. "Military property doesn't become legal to explore just because it looks abandoned." I explained that the gates had been open and no security was present when we'd arrived the previous night. Chen examined the checkpoint booth and confirmed there were no recent postings or warnings about restricted access. She noted that the facility appeared to have been decommissioned for several years, based on the vegetation growth and structural deterioration. We made our way through the same flooded corridors I'd navigated the night before, but the atmosphere was completely different in daylight. Natural light filtering through broken windows and damaged sections of the roof made the submerged areas look less ominous and more like an unfortunate consequence of poor drainage and structural damage. The basement staircase was exactly where I remembered it, behind the heavy steel door marked "Authorized Personnel Only." But when we descended into the flooded lower level, Deputy Martinez's waterproof spotlight revealed nothing unusual. The laboratory equipment and control room were exactly as I documented them in my photographs, but there was no sign of any human remains. "You said there was a message written on the wall?" Chen asked, as we examined the control panel with the emergency activation button. I directed my light to the spot where I'd seen the blood-red lettering the night before. The concrete wall was blank. No trace of any writing remained, not even faint stains or residue that might indicate something had been removed or painted over. The surface looked exactly like every other section of the basement walls, covered in algae and water stains, but otherwise unmarked. "There was definitely writing here," I insisted, running my hand across the smooth concrete. "In dried blood. It said something about pushing the button and saving people." Martinez and Chen exchanged glances. Chen took photographs of the wall section for their report, but I could tell neither officer was finding my account credible. We spent another 30 minutes searching the basement area thoroughly, checking every corridor and room for any sign of human remains or evidence of recent activity. "Son," Martinez said as we made our way back to the main level, "I've been working these swamps for a long time. People see all kinds of things in places like this, especially at night, when they're alone and scared. The mind can play powerful tricks when you're in a dangerous environment." David nodded in agreement, adjusting his weight to favor his uninjured leg. We'd been exploring for hours in contaminated water. I was already dealing with the snake bite, and James was down there alone in complete darkness for a while. Those aren't ideal conditions for accurate perception. I knew what I'd seen and experienced, but without any physical evidence or corroborating witnesses, my account sounded like exactly what the deputies were suggesting. Stress-induced hallucinations brought on by an extended period in a hazardous environment. The fact that the wall message had completely disappeared made the situation even more difficult to explain. We left the facility and returned to the patrol cars, where Martinez completed an incident report documenting our investigation. The official conclusion was that no evidence of human remains or criminal activity had been found at the location. Chen recommended that David seek medical follow-up for his snake bite, and that both of us avoid returning to the property without proper authorization. Later that afternoon, while David and I were packing our gear at the motel, we noticed increased activity at the facility. Military vehicles had arrived, unmarked trucks and personnel carriers that blocked access to the entrance gates. David drove past the checkpoint on our way out of town, and we could see soldiers in hazmat suits setting up a perimeter around the entire complex. A temporary sign posted at the gates read, "Contaminated site. Authorized personnel only. By order of U.S. Army Corps of Engineers." The sign referenced environmental cleanup procedures and warned of prosecution for unauthorized access. Within hours, the facility had been transformed from an abandoned exploration site into an active military operation. I never returned to that location, though I spent months researching the facility's history and trying to find official records about its operations or decommissioning. Every search led to classified documents or agencies that refused to provide information about the site. The satellite images I'd used to plan our expedition were updated within weeks, showing the facility as a restricted military installation rather than abandoned property. The memory of that decomposed corpse with its tracking white eyes and powerful grip stayed with me through every subsequent exploration. In abandoned hospitals in Detroit, I found myself checking over my shoulder in empty corridors. While navigating flooded subway tunnels in New York, I would freeze whenever I heard unexpected splashing sounds. The rational part of my mind accepted that I'd probably experienced some form of hallucination brought on by stress and environmental factors, but the visceral memory of those grasping hands felt more real than anything I'd encountered before or since. David and I continued exploring together for several more months, but our partnership was never quite the same after the Louisiana incident. He'd become more cautious about remote locations and was less willing to push into unexplored areas when conditions became challenging. Eventually, we went our separate ways, pursuing different types of urban exploration that matched our individual comfort levels. But on quiet nights, especially when I'm alone in abandoned places filled with dark water, I still remember the sound of that corpse moving through the flooded basement with deliberate purpose. I remember the feeling of decomposed flesh beneath my fingers and the strength that had no business existing in something that should have been dead for years. Those memories continued to haunt every exploration that followed, a constant reminder that some places hold secrets that are better left undisturbed.